My name is MAJ William Denn, U.S. Army officer, and today I'm here to share a big idea with you. Our military is struggling. Sequestration is downsizing the Army. We have dwindling resources for training, new equipment, but at the same time, demands, missions, and our threats overseas are all increasing. The U.S. needs to dramatically change how we are approaching our strategy. Business as usual won't cut it. So here's my idea. Building partner capacity, which means building up and training friendly nations, is the way forward. But it will require sustainable solutions for our partner nations to be effective. In Afghanistan, we call this Afghan good enough. Let me share with you a story to articulate my point. It was a fall morning in 2010. In the remote mountains of eastern Afghanistan, I stepped into a dimly lit Afghan Security Force command center. The crude cinder block and plywood buildings reeked of chai, body odor, and cigarettes. An Afghan Army officer was watching Afghan Star, which was an American Idol knockoff, while an Afghan police officer in flip-flops in his t-shirt played a computer game, popping bubbles. Pop, pop, pop. A third Afghan, a colonel in the border police, napped in a large leather chair, his snores rising above the pop, pop, pop of the computer game. The only person seemingly at work was a junior policeman, answering the occasional radio reports from a distant outpost in the Pakistani border. 1 week earlier, I had arrived in Afghanistan to work as a military intelligence mentor for the Afghan security forces. My command sent me and my small team to assist in Gardez, which was a regional hub in eastern Afghanistan, an hour helicopter flight from Kabul. Mentors like myself would rotate in and out every year, when we would work side by side with our Afghan counterparts to help advise them, train them, and evaluate them for the U.S. chain of command. It had barely been a year and a half since I completed a tour in Iraq, where we American soldiers had a saying, Iraqi good enough. It meant that we would inevitably be disappointed if we expected the Iraqis to approach the competency of U.S. troops. The Iraqi Army needed to raise its performance standards, but we needed to moderate our expectations. Iraqi good enough. Looking at this ragtag bunch in the command center, I suspected we would need to find an even lower bar for Afghan good enough. Afghan good enough proved to be an elusive and indefinable goal that could only really be tested if NATO forces completely withdrew. The war had already become the longest conflict in U.S. history, as mentors like myself rotated through year after year. In the meanwhile, we would keep training them as long as we could until at some point U.S. political will evaporated. But here in Gardez, looking at this relatively new headquarters, just getting them to a point of being able to manage their intelligence independently would be a critical step towards handing over responsibility for security. Colonel Gul Mohammed, the command center's intelligence officer, looked like a stereotypical Afghan Army officer. His gray beard fell to his chest. His tanned and weathered face from too many years in Afghan's unforgiving sun and brutal winters made him look well beyond the age of 42. His smile was full of rotting teeth stained from years of tobacco use. Formerly a tailor, Colonel Mohammed, like the other 72% of the country, never learned how to read. But he did know rudimentary math, which set him apart as having strong potential for military intelligence. Afghan good enough, I guess. It didn't take me long to identify that Mohammed's team lacked the necessary skills to analyze patterns and predict future Taliban attacks. Trend analysis could allow Mohammed to more efficiently advise his commander where to position his troops to fight the Taliban. His radio operators already meticulously logged each and every attack. But that was the extent of their work. I could tell that Mohammed was excited about this new computer the previous mentors brought to him. It was time to put it to good use, rather than playing a bubble game every day. If he maintained a spreadsheet of past attacks, it would dramatically aid his analysis of enemy patterns. In my mind, it was a simple task. His staff was already logging the attacks. How difficult would it be to digitally standardize the entries for analysis? 4 hours later, I hadn't made much progress getting him to understand why this was even important. Mohammed sensed my frustration. He said to me, "Captain, do you know where I was 10 years ago?" He pointed to a distant peak out the window. "I was leading my donkey up that mountain." He waved at the computers that we had given him in his headquarters, at the phones, the lights, all the books of unused data. And he said, none of this matters. Because do you know where I'll be after you Americans leave? As he pointed back out the window at the mountain in the distance, I pictured him leading his donkey again. There was wisdom in highlighting the futility and absurdity of it all. The fact that I was teaching Microsoft Excel to a man who couldn't read and probably wouldn't have electricity or internet in his office after America withdrew. American troops have been trying to train the Afghan forces for over a decade. Building an army from scratch from a population all with less than an elementary school education was extremely difficult, especially when we taught them operating from a graduate degree mentality. But perhaps our arrogance and lofty expectations, rather than Afghan ignorance, was precisely the problem. The complex, sophisticated, and technologically advanced techniques that we prided ourselves in mastering would never be Afghan good enough for the Afghans themselves. We could spend the next decade teaching PowerPoint of the latest counterinsurgency strategies, emerging from the numerous think tanks, war colleges, centers of academia, but the reality was this was their war, their struggle, and we needed solutions that they developed and owned themselves. Instead of teaching Excel that night, we spent the evening sharing chai, talking about the province's many tribes. Over the course of the next year, I did push Muhammad, but I pushed him to design his own processes, ones that he could own, that still provided intelligence of value, only in an Afghan way. I realized that most days, Afghan good enough will always be better than American good enough. It took us a long time to realize that Afghan-derived solutions are our only exit strategy. Now, many pundits say that America will not repeat an Iraq or Afghan-style conflict in the near future, and I agree. We've shown that nation building to be too costly and unwieldy in the long term. But that doesn't mean Afghanistan's lessons are not applicable for future operations. The threat of terrorism still exists, and in many places like Syria, Libya, Mali, Yemen, and Somalia, it continues to grow. Under today's downsizing military budget, the U.S. can't be expected to be perpetually fighting everywhere terrorism emerges. Local governments with their military and civilian forces must do their part to root out groups like ISIS and Boko Haram. But these local forces must be trained and supported. Now, the U.S. Army is taking the lead in this. We are sending forces all over the globe to train partner nations. But in each country, we will need to help them figure out their own version of Afghan good enough. Sustainable strategies that they can own and execute independently. If we can achieve this, we can build counterterrorism capacity around the world despite our own reduced military presence. There are risks, however. As we saw in Iraq last year with the fall of Mosul, and in Yemen with their civil war, without stable political conditions, it doesn't matter how well we train an army. If locals don't believe in their government, they won't fight. And if the government is so weak and fragile that we can't train them, it won't work either. So building partner capacity requires the State Department to provide sustainable governance solutions and assistance as much as the military needs to find sustainable military solutions. But through a concerted whole-of-government approach to build up our allies and partners, we can be effective so the U.S. military doesn't have to be everywhere at once. Sustainable solutions will be the key to building partner capacity. And my experiences in Afghanistan give me hope. Colonel Muhammad may still be leading his donkey in the mountain, but following him will be the rest of the Afghan army, fighting for their nation. Afghan good enough. Thank you.